I've just read an article about Black Lives Matter in South African sports, essentially, and that the rugby captain um, Sia Colsey, I hope I'm saying his name right. I don't really watch spectator sports, so let me get the story up. It's it seems interesting that they say that they're not going to have a united response to Black Lives Matter, and that individual rugby players will do whatever they feel is appropriate. And that, basically there's this universal idea that when you take the knee, that you are showing your support for Black Lives Matter. Um, and that what they're going to do as a team is they're going to bring in external people to have conversations about this issue so that they can generate a united sort of consensus within the team, and that they're just going to sort of have an internal conversation about this. I think that's quite a clever approach, because that sort of uh, it's sort of ambiguous as to what the actual conclusion is. Um, because there's certainly a lot to think about this issue, and I'm going to give my own contribution to this topic. So, I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement is a fascistic movement. Um, it's just like the Nazis complained about their historical disadvantage, essentially as a generalization, as a category, as a group, and that was their excuse to interpret reality and interpret society into factional designated categories of race, which was sort of strewn in this ideological narrative that has a kind of mythology of blood and soil and such. And you can see how Black Lives Matter is the wedge in creating the same mythology about race. It is the ignition of the racial imagination. It is the resurgence of Nazi philosophy, to put it simply. And you can see it very clearly in the sports sort of sector, because when you take the knee during the anthem or before the game or whatever, you are basically you are showing your higher allegiance not to a common identity of municipal, a common citizenry of a single nationality, which becomes everyone's unified identity, but you are showing a higher allegiance to the racial faction, to the racial designation. And you're showing that essentially that people's real interests are not catered to by municipal politics. They're only catered to by racial politics and racialistic solutions, and a racializing of every issue. And so it's the rejection of non-racialism, and it's a rejection of the South African Constitution, so that it can promote this disgusting vision of a so-called anti-racist, which is just another way of saying uh, a very deeply entrenched racialistic uh, um, non-solution. I mean, the kind of the tautology, the circular thinking that goes into the Black Lives Matter movement is a kind of cultural totalitarianism. Is a kind of it's a reality tunnel. It becomes true by interpretation. If you decide to interpret society in that way, then all its conclusions are used in the premises of structuring that narrative. So it's becomes true by definition because you accept its racialist definitions, and you betray non-racialism. Um, yeah, I mean, I can go into further detail about the actual issues themselves, because the idea that you're going to sort of get a collection of statistics that show that people have differential outcomes based on these generalizations, because that's what a statistic is, it's a generalization. And then somehow you get to the idea that because of someone's racial designation, they deserve a kind of a special benefit, never mind their particular history and their particular experience. Somehow their experience is always a collective experience of their statistic, of their generalization. So you get sort of well-to-do black elites that are just as oppressed systemically because of the color of their skin. You get that kind of very strange sort of destruction and destabilization of trust, as trust is commodified and attached into the racial designation. And so you don't have to actually navigate life in an authentic way, in a way in which one is responsible for any of the outcomes, because you can always just say, no, 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 it's not that I didn't have the right competence, or I didn't have the right skills, or I didn't trust the right people, or I didn't trust the right reading of the situation. It's not about growing your ability and power of your own sort of trust in yourself and an actual development of self-confidence. It's instead, you can just leverage the accusation against the system. You can just say, no, 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 the reason why the outcome didn't happen the way I wanted it to is because of systemic oppression, and because there's a group of people who are holding me down. And so it changes essentially the goalpost, that you don't actually target disadvantage, you don't actually fix problems, because the problem is collectivized into essentially this abrogation of the notion of even trust doesn't exist. Trust is made into this ideological narrative. So, and it's a simple solution. It's an oversimplified solution, and obviously the ANC government has been using this kind of toxic rhetoric, this kind of toxic racialism, to cover over their tracks, because it is useful for elites. Essentially, they can leverage this ideology to cover over their decadence and their exploitation, and the kind of and the identity mongering, because when you're selling people their identity and their sort of their racialistic pride as the solution to all their problems, it's a very helpful diversion from actually having to do anything real. And then when you fail, you can just continually blame the scapegoat, the ideological scapegoat. So it's got a very sort of cynical pressure release valve, that it can never be held accountable, for its own ideological vision and its own sort of insolubility, when it doesn't actually deliver any tangible benefits from using its disgusting prejudiced bigotry as the form of the solution to the so-called problem, which ends up creating lowered standards, destabilized institutions. You destroy meritocracy, which means that you also destroy the ability to see how progress even occurs. You can't even measure what the actual problem is, because the whole landscape has been so distorted by this racialistic propaganda and scapegoating, and essentially race baiting, which essentially the whole question of whether you take the knee or not is essentially is the false dilemma being leveraged by the ideological narrative that sort of imposes a kind of a race baited accusation. It's sort of, you have to pass their test before you can even have your own thoughts taken based on what you say that your own thinking is. That it's just assumed that you think a certain way, unless you concede already to the power of the movement, unless you automatically sort of do what is demanded of you according to the movement. So their blanket accusation sticks to you unless you can prove the negative. It completely shifts the burden of proof. It completely destroys the realm of the individual, which is why even the captain's mentioning that people will be able to do their own sort of individual thing is should be commended as sort of at least the right gesture, although it will be somewhat moot if everyone takes the knee anyway. I would say in an ideal world, I would hope that 99% of all the players don't take the knee together, that would be somewhat more significant of a unified um, willingness to want to actually come to a solid conclusion and judgment on this, and to repudiate what is a toxic and vile racialist ideology. Now, apart from the Mott and Bailey tactic that the Black Lives Movement is, which is essentially it makes two claims. It makes a kind of a conservative, defensible claim that it just wants this to be looked at. It just wants a kind of a general activism. It just wants more focus on this issue, and then it has the kind of the more radical expression, the more radical demands, and then essentially they play the sort of this bait and switch that when people don't go along with their demands, they say, well, what we want is very little and you won't even give us that, and then and they just keep on retreating to that fortification of essentially the conservative interpretation of their radical rhetoric. But the premise of their whole movement, again, is essentially the cause of the identity, that the identity is the path to salvation, which is the same fascistic ideology, that you must be saved through your identity, that the Führer, the political arena is there to serve the cause of the identity and to deliver justice to the identity and to treat whatever generalizations are needed to be treated in order to increase the racialist pride as a form of redress. And this sort of this there are other elements to this, sadly, but that are sort of psychological to get into. But when you only care about the outcome, supposedly, and you don't care about the process, you end up with artificial outcomes that are unsustainable, and you don't even fix the actual problem. You instead create a superficial solution. And that is essentially what South Africa as a whole suffers from, and it is somewhat intrinsically, inexorably represented by this disgusting ideology and movement, Black Lives Matter, of identitarian concerns, which make it impossible to have secular democratic politics. You can't talk about issues in a realistic way. You have to talk about them as a cult member, as belonging to a particular faction, so that there can be no consensus, that you can entrench a kind of in-group and out-group politics that allows corrupt elites to insulate themselves from accountability for their bad policy design, for their unintelligent policy interventions, and they can use interventions cynically, which can be essentially used for corruption. There's a way in which this policy is the moral corruption that is the source of even government corruption, the endless corruption of the state, and also the corruption of the law, in as much as that the law has now completely betrayed constitutional values and founding ideals like non-racialism. So it's very dark times that we live in. It would be nice if there were some public gestures repudiating this disgusting racialist politics. I can only imagine if they're actually going to get proponents of identity politics to come in and have conversations about that how disgusting that will be. Just how utterly, how the kind of the psychological perversion that goes into those kinds of conversations. I mean, it's, that's almost like Orwellian speak to call it a conversation, because it's a conversation that's premised on essentially ideologically scapegoating a whole generalization of people based on their race in order to create a fake form of ideological self-righteousness and sanctimoniousness and sort of, and people must take the branding from this ideology that they are the cause of systemic oppression, and that only by owning up to their white privilege does anything get solved, when it's such a distraction, it's such a diversion. It has nothing to do with anything practical. It has nothing to do with anything pragmatic. It's a virtual solution, which is the shell of all the corruption that we have in this country, because it is a moral corruption. It is premised in corrupt morality, in immorality. It's premised in racialist thinking. But I mean, fascistic ideology has always had this convoluted, confusing, sort of muddling. It always tries to make situations messy to the extreme, so that you just fall into their creed of their external locus of control, that you will buy their oversimplified formula of how to solve problems, which isn't a way to solve any real problem, which is fundamentally disempowering, because it forces people to believe in an external locus of control. It forces people to take on this kind of collective guilt and collective shame, and this collective project of re-establishing racial pride as a way to solve their problems, when that racialist pride has nothing to do with anything on the ground. And the idea that, like, the program of excavating historically racialist pride is going to have some kind of regenerative effect on the present is just, it's a, well, it undermines reconciliation, but it also uh, it's a fundamentally false kind of psychologizing of a real issue. And in that confusion, in that conflation, which is, I would say, it's always promoted by the worst people. It's promoted like people like Julius Malema, who are obviously corrupt, tyrannical demagogues who use this disgusting rhetoric to advance their own causes, under the guise of selling protection to their identity and to the cause of the identity and to being representatives of their identity, so that only tokens and representatives will ever be empowered by this disgusting ideology, while opportunity and civil society at large is destabilized, and as it's mediated and arbitrated by these disgusting identitarian fascists who want to control everything, who want to get in the way of everything and to monitor and license everything, as we have a kind of a disgusting centralized control based on a kind of supposed racialist justice, while opportunities dry up and networking becomes impossible because everyone has to play a disgusting form of racialist quota fulfilling, that you have to do this kind of racialist accounting, that small and medium businesses just can't deal with this. Because it's hard enough just to get people with the right skills. Now you have to start counting skin color, and weighing skin color and having certain percentages, like it's impossible. It's utterly, it's mentally feeble. It only works on the level of very big corporations, and it doesn't even work that well on that scale. But it is something that big corporations can do better than the little guy can. It's much easier for a big bureaucracy to tick these kinds of boxes. And so then we end up with a society in which we have no growth, because the engine of growth, especially in a developing economy, is the small and medium business sector. And entrepreneurs can't deal with this kind of toxicity. They can't deal with this kind of toxic red tape, which is completely arbitrary to having a successful business model. But it's made the center of everything. It's made the solution to every problem. That if we racialize all of our regulations, then at the same time as business as usual will have a kind of healing, when it isn't a healing. It's a retributivistic sort of revenge, a kind of vindictive, spiteful idea that if you hurt someone, then relatively speaking, if you hurt a group of people, then another group of people will somewhat, relatively speaking, be in a better position. And that is how the racialist pride is accumulated, basically. That if collectively white people are brought down many pegs, then relativistically speaking, black people or people of color will be raised a certain amount of pegs. I mean, like that's doesn't matter that the actual opportunities in the system have been destroyed. It doesn't matter that the general ability of the system to fund, sort of policies and fund the state to be more effective at developing. It doesn't matter that tax collections go down. It just matters that the relativistic racialist pride is that's all they care about. That's all they obsess about. And under that banner, under that disgusting project, you can hide any amount of corruption, because you're essentially you're giving benefits to people based on a superficial sort of representation, based on a superficial tokenism of their group, that they are going to be awarded something that has nothing to do with merit, that has nothing to do with actually assisting people overcome disadvantage that they have inherited from a historical residue of apartheid. You don't even care about helping people that actually have real problems. It's that their identity has the problem. Their racial category is the thing that is disadvantaged. And this is the kind of corruption that is facilitated when you believe in these kinds of reductive, disgusting racialist dogma. And it opens the door to just endless corruption. And that's what we live with in South Africa. So, I mean, yeah, the idea that in South Africa, when we have a constitution that is non-racialist, that we have to be told that Black Lives Matter, that the reason why things aren't improving is because we don't believe that Black Lives Matter, is fucking insulting. It is dishonest. It is intellectually dishonest. The thing, if anyone needs to be told that Black Lives Matter, it's in the vogue, it's in the level at which non-racialism has been betrayed, and therefore the state in South Africa is prone to this level of corruption and cynical exploitation of using the poor as a human shield for corruption. If you can put a non-racialist twist on Black Lives Matter to ironically show the fault and where the fault and accountability actually lies, which is not with apartheid. It's been how many years now, and we're not developing. Why aren't we developing? It's because of this disgusting racialist perversion of the South African Constitution and betrayal of the South African Constitution. So, I mean, the sports minister, being a minister in an ANC government, he should be ashamed of himself. I mean, and especially for this race baiting, promoting this disgusting race baiting, because it's fashionable. Never mind the actual constitution in this country. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on this issue. Obviously, it's a very depressing topic that we even. It's depressing for me going through the news stories, because you just see how many of these activist journalists who believe in this racialist propaganda, and that's what their agenda is they promote this fascist ideology, and they just they write stories that have these false dilemmas built into their ideological narrative that they are basically broadcasting. It's like living through Weimar Germany all over again in the 1920s. That's the cultural situation that we're in currently. And if we don't start confronting these vile ideologues, we're going to have a worse sort of doom spiral. We're going to have... we're not going to be able to put... We're not... the new South Africa is not going to be resurrected. It's going to be taken over by these vile fascists. To further illustrate one of the points about trust, essentially, is that what the ideological narrative does in Black Lives Matter is it wants people to only trust in racial designation and categorization. That you don't trust in individuals, you don't trust in understanding reality or understanding problems in a real way. You have to believe it. You have to believe in interpreting problems in this very reductive, abstract, racialist imagination kind of way, where you translate all the moral consideration into the cause of the identity, the cause of the racial group itself, of some kind of collective lived experience or something like that. And you and you want to be able, what it's trying to get people into is, don't trust anything other than skin color. Don't interpret a situation in anything other than what people are doing as a gesture and as a sentiment towards promoting the interests of a skin color. And this is the problem, is that when you think in those terms, you think that there is such a thing that can promote the interests of a skin color. What does that get you? That gets you corrupt politics. That gets you devastating destruction and the loss of opportunities because of slowing down everything with this disgusting racialist red tape. It stops things from happening because it creates obstacles. And the idea is that, well, you create enough obstacles, then you force people to go along other channels. Well, actually, no, that's not what happens. You force nothing to happen. You force a general slowdown. You force essentially destabilization, because you stop people from making the connections that they would otherwise make voluntarily, and you coerce people and you mandate that people have those interactions. And so there's no way to even prove that there's been any transformation. There's no way to even evaluate the level to which transformation has happened, because it only happens because of this mandate, because of this coercion from the state. And so you don't even get a feeling that there's any kind of development, because you have only this weird kind of artificial, ideologically infused development, which is also fundamentally unsustainable, and which is essentially, you know, it doesn't have its own integrity. So it has to borrow the integrity from the racialist pride. It has to borrow the integrity from trust in your skin color only. So you end up being left with nothing but your racial category as the way to navigate life, instead of having an independent vision of trust of how to do anything. And so you end up being, it's impossible for you to have self-competence or self-confidence in your own competencies. You can't even develop competency, because competency becomes a function and becomes translated into some kind of weird racialist language and weird racialist, everything becomes reinterpreted according to the racialist imagination. And so you have a distorted picture of life. You have this weird sort of reality tunnel. You just have this crazy one size fits all solution, which is the color of your skin needs to be the guiding force in the situation. It dehumanizes people fundamentally. It's disgusting in every way, shape, and form. And the ANC and the ANC who have cottoned onto this disgusting racialist fad and this fashion in so-called, in the pseudo intellectualism, they should be ashamed of themselves. I mean, this is not the old ANC. This is some new ANC, which is basically in many ways very indistinguishable from the EFF. They have the same moral sentiment on this, because this is how they stay in power, and this is how corruption is facilitated. So essentially, this is the fundamental dishonesty that the whole ideological narrative is founded on, is that you end up having only trust in the superficial thing, and you can't see the wood from the trees. You can't even fix problems as they exist, because the problems are all racial problems. They're not practical problems. So you've distorted the world into an ideological soup, and that's all you can feed your followers. That's all you can do to kind of egg them on. And this is a doom spiral, and it just makes people more and more dependent on a kind of political representation for their race, for their identity, and everything becomes essentially ethnocentric politics. There's no secular democracy. It's fascistic politics. And that's what the Black Lives Matter movement is all about. Um, it's disgusting. It should be rejected. It should be openly confronted. It should be called out. But the academics, the historians, they have all taken on their new ideological role to create a new mythology for a kind of racialist liberation movement. It's just what happened in Nazi Germany, where all the weak people in white lab coats in academia use their credentials to pander to the ideology, to help facilitate it, to create fake science, in the same way that the American Psychological Association, has cottoned on to the toxic masculinity. And we have to remember that all the all the identity politics came from feminism. Intersectional feminism was the mother of identity politics and this new breed of racial fascism. Um, and and all of its way of thinking about things is the same in terms of feminism. That you have this systemic oppression, which is always the scapegoat. It's never that women choose different things. It's that no, the structure itself is producing the outcomes, and so they deserve to be able to dictate what the new structure should be, and will only know that it's correct when we have equal outcomes in every statistic. It's that kind of very strange, nonsensical logic that equality of outcome is the measure. Never mind actually looking at why there are inequalities in outcome, and addressing them when they can be addressed, because some of those issues can't be addressed, perhaps because women just have different preferences. They make different choices. And you can't, unless you're going to force women to make the same choices as men, or force men to make the same choices as women, there is no way in which you're going to have an equality of outcome. And this is the same for people with different histories and backgrounds, and people make different decisions. To the extent to which that people are held back by residues of history, and by disadvantages which they themselves are saddled with, the state is directed in the Constitution to make uh, uh, to enhance equality by essentially trying to facilitate opportunity, and to open opportunity, and to target disadvantage, and to ameliorate it, to specifically create specific programs of fixing disadvantages. But that means you actually have to target a real disadvantage. Systemic oppression might be a theory that uses the word disadvantage, but it's not a tangible disadvantage. That's a tautological claim. That's a culturally totalitarian kind of complaint. Because if you can complain that there's this nebulous thing called systemic oppression, and you can't describe what's causing it except to blame a whole generalization, a whole group of people that you're going to deprive of social justice, because that's what social justice means in the Constitution, that you cannot treat people according to group guilt, that you cannot, that you must, whatever you do, you have to give justice to the individual, and you cannot treat people like a block. You cannot treat people like a generalization in order to get what you want. The only thing that you're allowed to treat is disadvantage. But you can't generalize disadvantage and give people a disadvantage that they don't have because of some abstract statistical umbrella that you make. Oh, well, we're looking at the statistics and they look unequal. Therefore, these people as an entire group, every individual in that group must be disadvantaged. I mean, that's absolutely crazy. And it's that kind of loose thinking which means that you can never address real problems, because you're stuck with that oversimplified solution, the, which is, I mean, it's basically nonsense. It's a word game, and it only gets away with itself if you actually believe that race is canonical, that race is higher, is more important than any other consideration. That you believe that you owe something to your race, and your race should bestow something upon you. It only works if you're a racialist. And so that's what we have done with identity politics, is we've just destroyed the morality of large sections of our population by inculcating them into this fascistic morality. And we have created toxic people who are now basically incapable of having an internal locus of control. They're incapable of trusting anything other than race, essentially. Their racial imagination is on high. And I think you might be able to sort of at some point we might be able to manage them as a collective politically by by getting things back to normal to some degree, by confronting them outright, confronting their ideology and suppressing their ideology as being a poisonous betrayal of the South African Constitution. But maybe we can get these people sort of dormant. But I mean, these are the people in every generation which hold society back. Um, and they can be proven wrong, but it's very hard in the experience of the new South Africa to prove these people wrong, because we never really got to have a state that actually had the kind of policy that the new South Africa deserves, that actually had a vision to use liberty and to use liberal values to grow opportunity, and for the state to assist in bringing people up, uh, um, rather than to give blanket quotas, to racial categories. The state never targeted disadvantage, so we never actually had a vision of how transformation could be sped up, and instead we've actually almost had stagnation in transformation. Well, I mean, it's hard to say these things because we have a weird kind of artificial development now, where we have whole sections of the economy which are functionally dysfunctional because they're only propped up by state mandates. And it's, obviously we can't afford it as a nation, but also the kind of the low quality education that has been facilitated by this kind of corrupt statecraft, because we don't focus on the right things, we don't have the right priorities, because identity politics becomes an all-consuming sort of idolatry, and an all-consuming sort of explanation of why things happen. Oh, it happened because of race, it happened because of group membership. So we need to change the rules of the game to invert how the system is bestowing benefits. So we need to create a kind of ideological racialist privilege. It's completely reactionary. Uh, I mean, you can understand that's what the promise of Nazi Germany was: is that we're going to enhance the interests of the ethnicity. We're going to promote the interests of the ethnicity, not the interests of the individual. We're not going to fix disadvantages. We're going to enhance the interests. So the real interests of people no longer become the interests of the state, the common interests of a common citizenry. They become the interests of your racial designation. And so this is the re-emergence of the morality of apartheid. Really, I mean, these are disgusting racialists, and they should be confronted. Um, but sadly, we don't have many people with a backbone. Instead, we've got people on the radio who just promote this disgusting racialist agenda. 567 medium wave. Eusebius McKaiser, who is now, at least they don't show him on 567 medium wave, but these disgusting fascistic ideologues, all cooing along to their disgusting agenda. So, another way of summarizing the problem with how this corrupts the notion of trust, or the very concept of trust, is that basically symbolism is taken to be more important than practical reality, or understanding issues. When you racialize the issue, it becomes essentially already a generalization. And then you can already complain about systemic oppression as this vague and nebulous, sort of thing, as this collective force and condition. And you don't ever have to do any particular work in fixing the problem, because the problem always centers around the scapegoat, the ideological scapegoat. It never centers around tangible measures that will improve the situation. Somehow the situation will be improved by attacking the scapegoat, by extracting a kind of redistributive justice, by a kind of collective guilt and shame. And if everyone believes in this narrative, that then you will already sort of, everyone will be willing to do what is needed to make the situation better somehow. But, it never gets into the practical domain because you're in the domain of symbolism. And then you believe that essentially symbolic gestures and symbolic collective guilt and symbolic, disgusting fascistic politics from politicians enforcing compliance with these disgusting moral corruptions of obsessing oneself with trusting in the symbolism of racial skin color as the proxy for knowing how to treat people in such a way that the narrative is satisfied, that the narrative is making progress or something like that. Um, which again, like, it conveniently makes this external locus of control. It conveniently makes all the issues a kind of a collective condition which can only be treated by individuals making symbolic gestures. And so you don't ever make any real progress, um, but you believe in symbolic progress. And therefore you can believe in taking a kind of symbolic comfort in convenient sort of leveraging of the narrative. So, you can choose to basically extract a kind of ideological validation by attacking someone based on the ideological narrative. But by compelling someone to deal with your subjective perspective on something, you just have to make a kind of hysterical grandstanding, complaint about statistics and about generalizations, sort of implying that you're on the side of the victim and everyone else that doesn't agree with you is hurting the victim. And so you just keep on framing all of reality like that, and therefore everyone can't complain about the symbolic gestures and the symbolic treatment of individuals that are taken to be representatives of their whole group of people. And so you give people symbolic reparations which are only received by individuals, which end up hurting the entire system and hurting opportunities for everyone, because the system gets taxed by having to facilitate these ad hoc, distortions of what would otherwise be an organically growing system. I mean, it's natural that a developing country should have high growth, but we don't have that because we have racialist legislation instead, and so-called racialist symbolic solutions to these historical problems. And so you can see the toxic leveraging of history in order to self-indulge in this kind of self-inflicted destruction, which then that destruction gets repurposed as blaming collective systemic oppression. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy of a kind of, that the more that their ideology fails, the more that they are allowed to complain about systemic oppression because their solution makes the situation worse. And then they can use that as fuel to force everyone to agree with them, because that's what they get instead of actually solving the problem. Is they extract a kind of observance. They extract a kind of, you must join the cult, because that's why things aren't working, is because you haven't joined the cult yet of understanding every issue in the world according to racial identity and designation, and looking at society via racial categorization. And so we can't see the real issues because all the issues have been transformed into racialist issues. And this is how these people destroy a state. This is how they hollow out capacity and they destroy intelligent decision making, because they have to make bad decisions because they have to believe in symbolism and they have to promote symbolism as the form of the solution. And so under that, they can also extract as much as they want. They can steal as much as they want, because there's no way that symbolically you're going to solve the problem, but you have to have a representation of that symbol, and you can silence people from complaining about it. So, I mean, Black Lives Matter is a decadent program that is ironically, it's the core of its narrative and its sentiment is almost the thing that toxically entrenches the problem. I mean, a lot of the problem is also quite virtual in that, it's about interpretation. It's interpreted into existence via this racial imagination by sort of targeting the ideological description of the problem rather than the actual pragmatic source of the problem, which cannot be looked at because those pragmatic things aren't racialist concerns. And when they conflate pragmatism with racialism, they get this external locus of control which they can essentially turn on like a tap. They can just invoke it whenever they wish. They can call it down, and they can accuse people of having to defend the negative. They have to. Someone else has to prove a negative just to escape the accusation of systemic oppression and white privilege. And this is just a complete distraction from developing a country. This has got nothing to do with development. And this is why we are where we are, because we cannot have an honest politics, cannot have a secular politics. It's all been destroyed by these opportunists. I mean, sadly, a lot of these people, especially in journalism, like Eusebius Mackays is a perfect example of this. This is someone who has benefited from racialist programs, advancing his academic career. I think he got the Rhodes Scholar, which he never even completed, or something like that, because I guess he's probably a bit of a mediocre pseudo intellectual, but he uses his degrees to try to give himself a kind of a credential. I mean, he changed his name to make it up, Mackiser, or the German word for king, Kaiser. I mean, what a pretentious, fascistic, small-minded racialist. But anyway, so you've got this kind of disgusting individual who has only gotten to the position that he has gotten to because of this racialist, kind of uh, um, pandering, and now he can't even have an authentic career because he's not clever enough to do anything other than be a broadcaster of this fascistic message. He's been indoctrinated into identity politics, and that's all he can push because it's so pseudo intellectual. It's so easy to just leverage generalizations in this way and to come across like a half convincing pseudo intellectual because you can just use some big words. And so you've got this thing where the one hand washes the other hand, because essentially, I mean, this is the same for the ANC politicians that steal so much and that loot the state coffers, is that now they have an ideological cover for their maladministration, and they're not going to let it go. It's too convenient. And there's no one in journalism who has the gall, who has the tenacity to stand up to it because of the groupthink. Because essentially, I've heard that the ANC controls a lot of the news media in this country because a lot of the papers were basically sold to people who were in connection with business people who are connected to the ANC and things like that. But I mean, and I mean, you can see the ideological bent in Prime Media, which is the owner of the radio shows, and so they have snuck their agenda in, and they have infiltrated their racialistic propaganda machine and advocacy, and it's like a cancer, and it's taken over society, and it perverts the Constitution, it betrays the Constitution. They have reinterpreted the Constitution to be a racialistic document. It's so disgusting. And these people, they're on public radio spouting this anti-constitutional rhetoric and propaganda. I mean, it's disgusting, and there's no conventional institutional voice to stand up to them, except very recently John Steenhuisen. is making perhaps political, is creating a political um, response now. But institutionally, all the institutions have been captured. I mean, even the Chief Justice and the Public Protector are like two ideological birds of a feather. They, even how they protect each other in in the court case that the Public Protector was complaining about how she was judged by another judge, um, appealing to the Constitutional Court that she can't be held responsible for the actions of, for the legal case that her office is responsible for, because she was just taking the advice of counsel. So she can't be blamed for the fact that her case was weak and failed, or that it was prone to criticism. The Public Protector cannot even be expected to underwrite the accountability of her own office. I mean, it's basically it's a semi. If you as a public protector cannot be responsible for the brief and how the brief of your office is conducted as a case, how your case is fought, and the argument and the strategy of your case. If you as a public protector cannot be held accountable for the case uh, uh, that that comes from the legal argument in the case that you have briefed some counsel on, then you're not fit to be the public protector. If you're not responsible for the legal interpretation, I mean, then essentially, yeah, I mean, it's actually pathetic. I mean, that essentially, that even people who are the public protector are going to be infantilized by the Chief Justice and essentially labeled as a minor, as essentially that they're not even responsible for their own legal arguments that represent the office of the public protector. I mean, that's pathetic. I mean, no one is responsible, not even the public protector is responsible for our own intellectualism, because of this external locus of control, which can be used to shield anyone from any accountability. There's no mediocrity that can't be excused and diverted by this ideological scapegoat, essentially. I mean, it's disgusting. I mean, you can just see the kind of the travesty, I mean, that is woven into the law uh, uh, as the law gets replaced by this disgusting Napoleonic legal positivism, essentially, where you can just interpret the law to mean anything, um, which the Chief Justice sadly has a horrible track record of doing. Um, of reinterpreting the Constitution in line with government policy, in line, because as long as the vision is supposedly constitutional enough, it doesn't matter how useless it is at actually affecting its own purpose. As long as it says that this is the purpose, it can do whatever it wants, essentially. That's what the Chief Justice, uh, uh, intentions matter. Your ideological intentions matter. If your ideological intentions agree with my ideological framework, you get a free pass. That's what the Chief Justice is all about. Non-racialism be damned. Non-racialism be betrayed. And he's cool with that. This is how states lose their credibility. The Constitution stands dead with a knife in the back, and the question is, can it be resurrected? That's where we are, also perhaps culturally as well, sadly, in this country, but legally as well. These things are going to have to be repaired at some point if the new South Africa is going to be recovered. How it will be repaired, I don't know. If the culture war can even go the right way, and if people can start to confront these evils,